Hello. I'd like to take a look at a topic I'm entitling, Did Freud Give Psychoanalysis and Depth Therapy a Bad Name? Well, I'd like to take a look real quick at this whole idea of psychoanalysis. Psycho meaning our minds, perhaps, or our psychology, and analysis meaning taking a rigorous, deep look and taking a look at all the component parts, taking it apart, so to speak, bit by bit. But how well of an analyst of any sort was Freud, in fact? Just because he said he was an analyst and that he was doing a good job of dissecting the mind, was he actually good at this or not? Or was he much more of a poet, in fact, who assembled a massive ideas from various literature sources? It's apparent. He did a wide amount of reading in literature and philosophy, perhaps sociology too. On vacations to Italy and other places, he collected a number of figurines, antiquity items perhaps. But what about being rigorous? How analytical was he? How gifted a mathematician was he, in fact? Probably not very good. He was a researcher for some years after medical school, but does that mean he was very analytical minded? I don't know. For research could possibly mean that he simply was doing a lot of procedural work, a lot of repetitive work, and that doesn't necessarily mean he was analyzing much of anything. So I think then this is perhaps one way psychoanalysis got off on a bad start, or depth therapy in general. That just because the originator or any analyst says that they are analyzing things doesn't mean that they're very good at it. Maybe the best people at analyzing things are those who make many millions and even billions of dollars on the stock market, or are hedge fund analysts, or maybe they're tech giants and Silicon Valley tycoons. Maybe they're the best analysts. Maybe Freud was rather on the opposite end in comparison, that maybe he could never design a Tesla car because he could never analyze the vast details involved, the complexities. It's just possible Freud was much more of a finger painter and poet, and had a bit of a grandiose notion that he was great at analyzing things, namely the mind, its emotions and thinking. Which isn't to say, of course, that he didn't have some great ideas and great underpinning concepts, but he could have gone off the deep end in other ways. Arguably, some would say overemphasizing sex versus, say, love, and getting your needs met in many ways. So I would bring that up first of all. Next, there's the matter of his overall demeanor, personality structure. If one were to look at photographs of him, there are collections of numerous photographs of him, and you would see, I think, him typically wearing a very erudite suit with a chain and gold watch. He loved to smoke cigars, so many, in fact, that he developed oral cancer and had some 30 operations. And all of this was quite painful and actually ended his life eventually. And he had to wear something in his mouth as an appliance to cope with all the processes, the surgeries. But at any rate, Is a man like this the most empathetic type person if he's so concerned about his appearance? Or was he, by this overemphasis on dress and appearance, trying to steer clients away, his patients, from a lack of efficacy and soundness, and a lack of capacity to think analytically, despite what he claimed to be the case, that he was a great analyst of anything, including the psyche, the mind, the emotions. You might say, too, he was excessively obsessive compulsive, and that he was very stern-looking. If you were to look at the space between his eyebrows and his general look, you would see a very stern man. Next, I might point out that he was very bent on creating an empire of sorts by the time he died, and in part this is reflected by giving his followers rings to signify they were part of his club. And if you were ejected from that club, he took the ring back. So, of course, one of the ejectees was Jung, and hence we have a split here in depth therapy, or analysis, if you will, from Jungian and Freudian. And finally, I would say that there's been some talk of the Oedipal complex, and how unfortunately the whole concept of depth therapy and psychoanalysis has been ridiculed, in part because of the Oedipal complex idea that Freud came out with. But how many people know that originally Freud believed very much in a lot of psychological maladies, suffering coming from child abuse, namely in his day sexual abuse, as he was focusing on from the beginning, and that maybe a year, 2, 3 years in, he decided that it's said in some writings of his that he was discovering so much sexual abuse that he thought his career would be highly damaged if he continued in this direction and it were publicly known his views. And so he jettisoned the whole emphasis on an examination on sexual abuse and covered it up with the Oedipal complex idea. This being brought up by Geoffrey Masson, an analyst originally trained in an analytic institute in Canada after receiving a Sanskrit PhD degree at Harvard. And he had been made at one point the official overseer of Freud's writings by Anna Freud, Freud's daughter. So, with all of this, I guess I would wonder 2 points here. First, just how analytically capable was Freud, and second, what was his character like for him to have been so bent on creating an empire and such a stern, obsessive man. If this is all the case about his character and his level of ability to think complexly, perhaps this gave the whole concept of analyzing our struggles in life deeply a bad taste in the mouth, so to speak. And he set a bad precedent, whereby today, when we ridicule somewhat psychoanalysis, I think we tend to do so by saying that's Freud's bailiwick, when in fact Freud was simply the start of it, or moreover the start of applying that name, psychoanalyst. And others have done work beyond him, who arguably we're not bent on creating an empire, and oftentimes perhaps not as obsessive and as low in level of empathy, arguably, too. I bring this up because the current approach to emotional problems tends to be of two ways. Either to try 10 sessions, say, of cognitive behavioral therapy, or pharmaceutical approaches. With depth therapy and psychoanalysis, all one package deal, I would say, being rather ridiculed and termed not to be provable and unscientific and not subject to verification by double-blind studies. But what is the extent to this being said because it's too costly for too many to obtain? And what about the fact that maybe psychoanalysis isn't always so effective because certain truths that would help the clients cannot easily be spoken publicly, including in the treatment room, because they concern matters of political correctness. And finally, what if depth therapy in general is suffering from the Freud syndrome, if you want to call it, whereby the minute someone says psychoanalysis, they think Freud and have a bad taste in the mouth right there. I think these are all things to consider, along with, of course, the matter of the use of the pharmaceutical approach being highly lucrative to many people, and it being a quick, easy solution to take a pill rather than delve into our emotional struggles for an extended and painful period of time before, what you might say, coming out the other end, if it were ever to happen, with no real guaranteed results. These are all things, that I can't prove, but I've looked at for many years and had personal experience with myself with a stint of psychoanalysis in my 20s with two analysts. And so I bring this up for consideration. Perhaps we've gone from one extreme to the other and ought to meld the two together. I wish you well.